city. Your council has voted.
Most sequels to successful games are safe, conservative iterations on the ideas of the original, but not here. Frostpunk 2 is a bold follow-up that takes an almost entirely different approach to its city-building strategy. It's set in the same bleak, iced-over world where people struggle to survive, but it's refreshing that we're not retreading the same frozen ground. Everything from how you place buildings to how you manage resources and heat your city is a new spin, and its political system is a creative way to interact with the people of New London that does a great job of conveying a sense of quid pro quo negotiation in a representative democracy. The zoomed-out perspective does mean that we lose a lot of the feeling of intimacy that made the first game truly stand out, but there's no shortage of morally questionable decisions to make as you're building your society.
Merely surviving is not enough. We have to expand. After all, it's us who survived the end of the world. It's us who survived.
A frosty atmosphere is strong thanks to bone-chilling weather effects and dramatic music that swells as tension in your city increases. Coming from a replay of the first Frostpunk, I was initially missing the ability to see people walking in the streets, but you do hear from them a lot, so it doesn't feel like a ghost town.
Bundle up. It's getting colder.
Obviously everything's covered in white snow and ice, but there are features like mountains and cliffs to give each area its own look, and as you build, it becomes much more colorful thanks to intricate districts and the automatically created power lines. The 5-chapter story mode serves as something of a tutorial for the sandbox Utopia Builder mode. Though aside from a few short cutscenes, there isn't a whole lot of plot driving you forward toward your objectives. There's a direct bridge to the events of the first game as you take over the city of New London, but the vast majority of story comes in brief, affecting vignettes about life in the frozen wastes. There is a lot of information to cover as you learn to place and expand multi-tile districts for housing, food production, resource and fuel extraction, industry, and logistics, each with its own set of upgrade buildings, plus single-tile hub buildings with adjacency bonuses. It's an interesting city-building puzzle with a couple of questionable quirks. The ice-breaking system, which requires you to first clear out batches of tiles before you can build on them, makes sense in the fiction, but feels like busy work that just slows down how quickly you can act on a plan. It's also frustrating that you can't reposition any single tile without demolishing the entire district and starting over. But at least you get all of your resources back when you do that, so all it costs you is time. When you zoom out to the vast and even more barren Frostlands map with these very Game of Thrones inspired icons for your colony and outposts, you'll send your scouts out on dispatch missions to discover many of the resources and population you'll need to keep your colony going. It's much more built out than the original's version of Frostlands because here you connect everything with roads to get a steady stream of resources, then found and upgrade outposts and even full satellite colonies to keep New London fed. It's very much a side activity, but the rewards there are so crucial to building your city that I was motivated to check it frequently and keep the resources coming. I'd love to be able to zoom out a little bit further though, because the Frostland maps can get huge.
Please do not be scandalized by the liberated youth's behavior.
The challenge of feeding your colony's central generator's need for fuel and keeping the city supplied with heat, food, and materials is fairly conventional and straightforward for supply chain games, though in a few major ways it does become more complicated at times. For one thing, massive whiteout storms hit every so often and shut down the entire Frostlands map, disrupting supply chains and leaving you to subsist on your stockpiles for months at a time. That means you can't just produce enough to keep the lights on and call it a day. You need to overproduce as hard as you can to avoid having your people freeze to death by the hundreds. Speaking of freezing, I did hit a couple of bugs with the interface, such as where I had to click on a certain dialogue choice a bunch of times before it would register. Sometimes the buttons on the UI would overlap, and clicking on it would register the button underneath instead of the one that was more visible on top. It's also a little annoying that it locks up for several seconds during an autosave, but there was nothing severe. Arguably the centerpiece of Frostpunk 2, though, is its faction and government systems.
The delegates have reached a decision. A new law takes hold.
This is where you gotta strike a balance between opposing groups of citizens by keeping promises around how they'd like to see you run the place. If you don't, you get into trouble when your people lose trust in you or the tension level rises to the point where they boot you out of office. It's all too easy for a shortage of any of the resources to send you into a downward spiral where everybody's mad at everybody else and society collapses. My first time through, I made the rookie mistake of assuming I could blow off one faction entirely if I kept the others happy, and at first it seemed to work.
A law has passed in the council. Take heed.
You can research whatever technologies you want with the push of a button and a small fee, but passing laws can only be done through the council, which is made up of 100 representatives of your city's factions. Bribing, or rather persuading, a faction to vote your way is a matter of making promises. Most of the time they want you to research a specific tech, or pass a law that aligns with that faction's worldview, but sometimes I'll take cold hard cash, ironically called heat stamps. I had a lot of fun with the way that, if you play your cards right, you can often be rewarded for doing what you were planning on doing anyway. The interface helpfully tells you which version of each research option is supported by which faction. That lets you go to them and see if they'll ask you for it, and if they do, you'll build extra trust when you research it. And it's always hilarious to promise a bothersome faction they get to choose the next law to be voted on as a favor, only to then whip votes against them and see them get nothing.
Hear ye, hear ye. The proposed law has been rejected.
So I could usually pass any law I wanted with a supermajority of support, ignoring the extremists who are upset when I push through policies like free essentials to feed the people or accept all outsiders to boost my population. But the catch is, until you unlock some of the heavier-handed and authoritarian policies, that approach leaves you vulnerable to protests that shut down your production in your districts and raise tension through the roof. That means you'll have to come back to the table and negotiate, which can be difficult to do when riots are slowing everything to a crawl. You do get more tools to deal with dissenters as you go, up to and including rounding them all up and leaving them to freeze to death in outdoor prisons, but many of those cause tension to rise and trust to fall when used. There's no easy answer, which makes it a compelling problem to solve.
The city grows.
My first run of the story mode took about 15 hours, including a restart when I figured out exactly how bad my initial decisions had been. I've since put in another 20 in the Utopia Builder sandbox mode with objectives like founding multiple colonies with 10,000 residents or building tall with 50,000 in your home base. And there's a promising amount of replay potential in Frostpunk 2. Not only are there 6 main factions and their radicalized variants to mix and match,
Are now officially recognized by the city.
and 7 different Frostlands maps to play on, but there are different paths you can take by leaning into alternate philosophies, like equality and adaptation. Those unlock different radical ideas that are more powerful bonuses and really piss off opponents. Doing a run on a higher difficulty than Officer, the one recommended for Frostpunk veterans to start out with, would certainly require spending more time getting to know the faction's preferences than I did on my first successful run to avoid angering them unnecessarily. I can't help but feel we've lost something important, though, in expanding the small-scale perspective of the first game into a multi-colony big picture, one where you can only actually see your people when you hit a button to do a close-up to observe a handful of them milling around. For example, seeing a message pop up that 93 children died in a mine collapse doesn't really hit the same when it soon vanishes without obvious repercussions. It was a lot easier for me to think of those kids as just stats on a spreadsheet when they never even had names that I can view in the graveyard like I could in Frostpunk. Frostpunk 2 is just too big for that.
Will be held this evening to honor those who gave their lives in the mine.
Back up a second, you might say. What were 93 children doing in a mine in the first place? Well, I'm glad you asked. In one of my smarter decisions as steward of New London, one that was enabled by my choice to go with an apprenticeship system instead of mandatory schooling for children because it increased my workforce, I opted to send them in there to gather coal that was inaccessible to full-grown adults. The other option was to blast the way clear, but that would have given me less coal. No one could have foreseen anything going wrong with that plan.
This is no mine. It's a tomb.
Frostpunk 2 is always throwing decisions like that at you and then serving up consequences, often making me feel a little dirty for picking the one that gave me the boost the spreadsheet said I needed, despite the human cost. So, while it might not land the punches as effectively, it certainly takes a lot of swings, and those do add up. Building up multiple colonies, researching technologies, and passing laws in Frostpunk 2 is quite the act of plate spinning.
The eyes have it.
Just about anything you do is bound to make one of your city's factions angry at you, and a powerful storm can literally and figuratively freeze your entire economy. This city building sequel might have lost some of the intimacy of the original by thinking bigger, but what it's gained through its ambitious philosophy of reinvention rather than iteration means you can play it immediately after the original and not feel like you've done any of this before. For more, check out our reviews of Tactical Breach Wizards and Stormgate Early Access, and for everything else, stick with IGN.